cold breeze brushed through Drew's hair as he pulled the blue cape tighter. Charles had insisted that now would be the perfect time to go outside because the pouring rain from the morning had stopped, but he didn't consider this part of the weather. Now both of them had to bear the consequences. They were following a path often visited by chariots and servants that were traveling between the castle and the city part below. With 15 minutes by foot, it was the fastest route after all. But Drew and the barely living Charles weren't on transit. "We should be close," Charles stuttered through his violent shivers and looked into the thicket of oak trees. A wet sound came from the ground as he stepped off the road and into the woods. Drew considered whether going barefoot would be the better option. Just a moment later he learned that it would have been. His poor shoes were soaked in mud and water. "What are we looking for?" he asked and caught up with Charles. "Small yellow flowers on top of a ring of pointy leaves. They usually grow in groups," he recalled. "They are called winter aconite, but some people say winter wolf's bane to them. Pretty sick name, huh?" Finding a yellow flower among the rather dull plants seemed easier to do than convincing Frederick to chug a whole bottle of liquor. Not a huge deal for a mild alcoholic, but Drew still regretted offering his help. All the cooks knew of this little tradition Charles pursued every January, but never knew what it was about. They just knew that he was very serious when it came to the date, because he usually skipped the rest of his shift that day, a miracle for the structured man. When Charles muttered something about going, his chef had spoken to Drew about a small incident in which the lanky man had passed out on his way from work back to his bed, which caused him heavy bruising. Claiming to be too busy himself, Frederick had heavily hinted at the blond person to do something. One glance at Charles' deep dark rings under the eyes had been enough to convince him to be on the lookout, especially in the forest. The overworked man's life was at high risk, and Drew knew he'd feel guilty for the rest of his existence if something dangerous were to happen. After several minutes of stumbling through the forest, Drew dared to ask, "Are you sure they even bloom here?" "Almost certain. They were around here last year after all," he replied. "Or were they?" He scratched the stubbles of beard on his chin. "It could have also been that there wasn't enough light lately. Those cuties need that." "Oh!" Just by the sound you could guess that Charles' face had just lit up. Squatting down next to him, Drew watched him carefully removing leaves from the ground and revealing little flowers with round petals and a surprisingly vibrant lemon color. Quickly Charles reached for his belt to unfasten a sachet. "You have the cape. Can you pluck some of the aconites and throw them in?" He looked at Drew with excitement. The blond one hesitated, but quickly came to the realization that he had already dirtied the cloth and therefore followed his instructions. Why he insisted on picking plants that could have poisonous effects when coming into contact with skin was a mystery to him, though he suspected there to be either a personal connection or a symbolism behind the plant, like poison ivy, which was one of the plants he learned from to have a corny meaning about love, which Josephine loved so much. He himself wasn't a big enjoyer of plants, at least when it came to picking or taking care of them. To him they should be admired in their natural habitat, in which they mostly even looked the most aesthetically pleasing, as far as he could judge. Thanks to Drew's sense of orientation, they made it back to the street and to the city. The red rooftops of the houses could be seen from far away, as well as the marketplace where street performers and wandering traders could make a fortune on Saturdays. After all, it was a day for common people particularly reserved for both prayers to their goddess and celebration of health and peace. He had strolled through the streets with and without Josephine. Mostly they had to buy stock for the pantry, but from time to time Drew also bought himself and his roommate everyday objects, like a second set of pillows and blankets or clothes. Ironically, Drew made more money than Avery, whose only payment was the room they shared, even though he had a higher social rank than he. Drew assumed it was part of the deal he made with the king. He would obey every command given to him, while the king would give him the information needed to find his brother after 4 years of serving. It would be before this midsummer. "Don't stand still, we still got places to go," Charles reminded him. He must have stood still again. Other than Drew had expected, they did not enter the city, but took a small path through fields of dead grass covered in frost. "Where are we going?" he asked. "The graveyard, of course," Charles answered while looking back at him. "What, never been there before?" Drew shook his head. "I don't have family here." "Lucky you." The graveyard was exactly as the books he read described it. A large area with stones of various shapes, and a place for flowers and memoirs in front of them, scattered around with several trees that looked as old as time itself, watching over the rotting bodies of the dead. Charles went straight through the rows without giving a single look to any of the stones. Pretty far from the entrance he finally turned left and stopped in front of a small square stone. Moss had grown over the rough surface and Dew could barely make out the carved letters. Without wasting a moment, the tall man began removing any waste from it. Revealed were 3 names: Marvin, Rosalind, and James. "You can go now. Thanks for the company, I really appreciate that," Charles addressed Dew after a long pause, as if he just remembered that he was still standing beside him. "Are you sure?" There was no answer. He made his way back to the entrance, but got distracted by a stone tomb that was, different from all the others, located above the ground with 5 small statues of babies playing around it. Even though it had such a unique design, the grave had not been cared for in years. Piles of leaves, gravel, and dirt were covering everything, and there were no offerings. He got close and bent over the top, hoping to be able to discover a familiar name or more interesting details. To his disappointment, there was nothing to be seen, and he didn't want to touch anything without the knowledge who might have been buried here. He turned around and almost bumped into a black figure. "I'm sorry, sir, I didn't see you," he apologized automatically, but the old man laughed. "It's always good to know my stealth did not lose itself through all the years. But enough of that. Are you a friend of that boy?" He pointed at Charles, who had cowered down on the ground with his forehead pressed to the dirty ground. Dew pondered. "I wouldn't consider him a friend. We work together at the castle, but we rarely talk." Perhaps because he barely talks to anyone at all, Dew wanted to add, but kept it to himself. "That poor boy, he needs someone to talk to," the man in black sighed. "Do you know what he's doing there?" Charles was still in the same position, and Dew was worrying he would freeze to death at some point. "I do, at least a little. I met him 6 years ago, a 15-year-old kid covered in dirt and no parents whatsoever. He asked me to make that stone, and of course I said yes. When I asked him where the people he wanted it for were buried, he said that the king had burned them." A memory from half a year ago came to his mind. Josephine and him had gone to the market and came across a fire that had been newly piled up next to the gibbet. She hadn't noticed it early enough because the wind carried the scent of burning flesh away from them, but as they reached the fire it was clear that an execution of 2 or more people had taken place, and their bodies were now being disposed in front of everyone. The crown should be on everyone's mind, especially because it had lost more and more meaning to many. It had disturbed him, just like it was supposed to, and the thought that it could be him at some point couldn't get out of his head. Why he even considered it was nothing more than anxiety. Never would he do something harshly punishable. Sometimes he even considered himself a model citizen until he remembered all the times he had dutifully agreed with his chef whenever he began ranting about the king's inability to rule again. "When I asked him who they were," he continued to tell, "the boy said they were his older brother and parents. He was the only one left. I remember him saying, 'There was this round little child in the courtroom that cried out to the king to save the boy.' She must have warmed the king's heart that day." During the time Dew went back to the castle, he thought about what the gravedigger had said. A son in a family of bandits who had received a second chance. The king had killed them, his family, his life. Perhaps they were forced into stealing and robbing. Maybe they were from a poor place and shunned by society, which led them to be unable to live an honest life. Only Charles ended up getting to live like that, but at what cost? Now that he felt indebted to the royal family, he did everything to please them, even if it meant destroying himself in the process. Dew wondered how it felt like to be under the constant stress of perfection which was demanded from him on a daily basis if he wanted to keep his life. One misstep and that was it. He couldn't imagine how it was to be so dependent on another person to keep one safe.